Okay, so recent data from India has highlighted the progress that has been made in improving girls' education and enrollment in primary schooling. However, what we observe is that there still continue to remain significant differences with regards to secondary schooling, and particularly in rural areas. And furthermore, what we observe is that there's a heterogeneity across states, which means there are differences by states and by socioeconomic status, by caste, by religion, and so on. Simultaneously, we also observe low levels of female participation in the labor force. So these are some slides on why educating girls is important. As we all know that reducing gender gaps in schooling was one of the 8 Millennium Development Goals. And 2 of the Sustainable Development Goals also directly relate to improving gender equality in access to education by 2030. And there's a whole bunch of studies that have looked at the improvements in demographic outcomes and so on from having better educated women. So for instance, these studies by Malhotra et al., Murthy, and Reyes and Murthy, Foster and Rosenzweig from the 1990s have found that having a little bit of education actually improves the mortality, lowers the mortality rates and reduces fertility rates among women. And gender inequality in education also contributes to slower economic growth in developing countries. And there's a lot of literature which supports that. And also from a human rights perspective as well, having better educated women improves, fundamentally, it's good for human rights and freedom, and it's a worthy objective in its own right, and also it increases female wages, because if you have better educated women, then they have they can attract higher wages. So despite this, we see an underinvestment in girls' education. And what are some of those reasons? One is economic factors. For instance, we see in environments where there's low economic development, resource constraints, and under those circumstances, there's a competition for resources, and parents may not educate as much in girls' education as given that girls may not be the primary carers for the elderly parents. So that's one possibility. And also in environments where there's, we observe child labor, we see that girls are the ones who are held back to contribute to household chores, to contribute to looking after siblings, and they are typically also the ones whose schooling is reduced when there is a resource constraint. The other factor that has received attention in the literature is the fact that if there is a perception on the part of parents that future returns are higher from educating male children, then again we see that there is a greater impetus to educate male children relative to females. Okay, so what has been observed quite widely in data sets is that typically we observe higher expenditure on boys' education relative to girls, and boys are also more likely to be found to be enrolled in private schools with higher fees relative to girls. And then we also see this literature that has seen an inverse correlation between education and female labor force participation. So they see what they call a J-shaped relationship. At low levels of education, we find that female employment in the labor force is quite high. So for example, we can see low-paid agriculture workers, women working on construction sites, women working as maids, and so on. And then as the education increases, there's a drop-off in labor force participation among middle-class women. And again, we see very highly educated women being back in the labor force. So the question then becomes, why do we see this decline in female labor force participation? Because this is something formal labor force, and that proportion has been declining, and the decline has been greater among better educated women. So the question is it the case that if labor market returns to girls' schooling increases, are we likely to see more investment in girls' education? So some studies have said, yes, this is the case. If there are better labor market returns to girls' schooling, then yes, we'd see more girls involved in the labor market. When there are high levels of unemployment or underemployment, or not as many jobs in the white collar sector, then we may not see as many girls participating in or women participating in the labor market. Okay, then apart from that, there are also social factors that might explain why we see this gender wage gap and gender differences in education. One is this norm called patrilocal exogamy. This is the norm that daughters marry out and they are not there in the same village or around the parents. So there's less incentive to educate daughters who might marry out. And this patrilocal exogamy is associated with early marriage for girls, because in areas where crimes against women are quite high, parents may feel that it's better to educate the daughters. So Dyson and Moore and Chakrabarti and Kim, they have found that there is a north-south divide, where in the north, where patrilocal exogamy is widely practiced, we see that the trend is that the women are less likely to participate in the labor market, in the formal labor market, and the gender gaps in education are also higher. Other factors, of course, are dowry. Even though dowry is formally banned, we still see that during weddings, the bride's parents or bride's family will bear more of the wedding costs and gifts and so on. So having a daughter imposes quite a big, could be seen as imposing a burden on the parents' finances. Also, we see that there's a wide son preference, and son preference, of course, could be a result of all of these other factors in the background, like if the labor market returns are higher for women, if boys are the ones that are going to look after the parents in their old age, then we see that these social factors will lead to there being a gender gap in education as well as labor force participation. And also there is the issue of gender stereotyping, which means that if there is a perception that there are certain roles for women and women are more likely to marry and be housewives, then there's less incentive to educate or invest too much in a girl's education. Okay, so I just briefly want to talk about the key trends in different data sets with regards to gender gaps. So the Global Gender Gap Report, this is a report for around 100 and more than 100 countries. They found that over time, there has been improvements in wage equality for similar sorts of work. So the gap has been narrowing for similar sort of work. And for the first time, we see that across the world, we see that tertiary education gender gap is starting to close. And for the third year running, we've seen that primary and secondary education gaps have been closing. However, in terms of health and survival, we see that India still continues to rank quite low. And we see that in this sub-index, which is to do with health and survival, the gender gap is, for India at least, is widening between the surveys. Okay, so another recent data set, the ASER report, which is the Annual Status of Education report, which was conducted in 2018, and this was in rural areas. And they also found that the gender gap in enrollment is starting to close. So this, they did this survey in 2009 and 2014. And then they wrote the report in 2018. And what they observed is between 2009 and 2014, the increase in gap in learning outcomes. So the learning outcomes are, for instance, in reading ability and mathematics ability and so on. So these learning outcomes are found to be widening between government schools and private schools. Even after controlling for all the other factors, it seems that this gap is increasing, and learning outcomes in government schools were declining. So private schools, on the other hand, we see that they were either steady or the outcomes were improving. And this report also found that the government of India's right to education legislation has led to reducing the inequities in access between different states and has also improved the schooling infrastructure. So the right to education legislation has led to significant improvements in inequities between states. So according to the ASER report, if you look at this, this is looking at trends in children who are not enrolled in school. So looking at data from 2006 to 2018, and here we see for this, the blue line here is looking at boys who are aged 11 to 14 years of age. And here the pink line is girls. So what we see is that relative to 2006, between 2006 and 2018, the gap in children not being in school for girls has declined, and it's almost come very close to boys. So this gender gap has declined. So, and then we see the for 15 to 16-year-olds, for boys, we see that 20% of the boys approximately were not in school. And in 2006, for girls, the figure was about 22.6%. We see that this has been steadily declining, and there was a slight increase here, but steadily declining, and the gap has narrowed. And in 2018, we see that only 13.5% of the girls were not in school in this age group, 15 to 16. And the gap has also really narrowed down between girls and boys. So the trends are that gaps are narrowing, which is a good thing. And if you look at this table from the same data set, again, we see that if you look at the percentage of children that are enrolled in different types of schools by age group and gender in 2018, the interesting thing we see is that although the enrollment rates are quite high for girls and boys, we see that if you look at this, for example, 7 to 10-year-olds, we see that a higher proportion of girls are in government schools. And we see a higher proportion of boys are in private schools. So again, we see that over time, the proportion of children enrolled in schools is declining for both boys and girls. So enrollment in government schools is higher for girls than it is for boys. So remember that private schools are probably costing a bit more. And then if you look at the proportion of children who are not in school, we see that the gap between girls and boys is not that big. Okay. And in the primary school age, there's no gap. The secondary school age, in this group, slightly higher proportion of girls who are in school, who are not in school. But here we see that the gap has narrowed. Okay. So now what we want to look at is we want to look at the trends across different states. And again, the point I want to make here is the ASA report was looking at learning outcomes, so learning levels and performance of children. And then they wanted to look at children that are not in school. And this is again 2018. And we see that the percentage of children who are enrolled in private schools is, in some states like Haryana, it's 55.3%, Manipur is 70.4%. So it varies across different states. But if you look at the percentage of girls who are aged 11 to 14 who are not enrolled in schools, and percentage of girls 15 to 16 who are not enrolled in schools, we see, for example, a state like Bihar, it's quite low. Only 4.2% of girls aged 11 to 14 are not enrolled in school. And if you compare that perhaps with Uttar Pradesh, we see 7.4%, 7.4% in Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, and so it's quite high. And then if you look at 15 to 16-year-olds, again we see girls not in school. Bihar is actually, you see, it's only 9.8% of the girls in that age cohort who are not enrolled in schools, whereas in Chhattisgarh it's 21.2%, 22.2% in Uttar Pradesh. So in later in this presentation, I'll go through one of the programs introduced by the Bihar government to improve enrollment of girls in school, the cycle program. And we see that this program had a big effect on enrollment. So again, we see, look at learning outcomes, we see it's the learning outcomes are not that good. So among children in standard 3, percentage of children who can do at least some subtraction, the outcomes are not that good, in the sense that only small proportion of children can do it. So again, you look at Kerala, 47.9% of the children can do at least some subtraction. Mizoram, it's 58.9%. And then Madhya Pradesh, only 13.9%. Okay, so we see the point I'm trying to make in this slide is simply that we see differences depending on states and heterogeneity across states. Okay, if you look at trends in the NFHS data set, again we see urban women and younger women are more educated, and 34% of rural women have never attended school. It's only 16% among urban women in this sample. And here we see that Bihar has the lowest female literacy rate, at only 50% of the women are literate, and male literacy rate is 78%, and in Kerala, it's nearly universal. And then we see that the percentage of women with no schooling has decreased by 13 percentage points, and the percentage of women completing 12 or more years of schooling has increased by 10 percentage points. So the trends are in the right direction. So in the next slide, again, NFHS data, we look at rural-urban differences between male and female children depending on age groups. And again, we see in urban areas, near universal enrollment of children. Girls and boys, there's not much difference. On the other hand, slightly 1% higher girls attending schools, and rural areas also almost the same. Then if you look at 11 to 14-year-olds, again, the trend is almost similar, but we start seeing a decline in female education from ages 11 onwards. Here we see a small 2% difference between girls and boys in the 11 to 14 age group. By the time you get to 15 to 17, in rural areas, we see that that gap has increased to 10 years. But in urban areas, it's 70% for both girls and boys. Okay, so from a policy perspective, in the past, the main policy question was, how do we get children to enroll in school? But what we are seeing now is that we see that in the primary school, at least, we saw that enrollment is nearly universal. So the question now is, how do we improve learning outcomes? How do we get, how do we ensure that the children who are attending schools are able to have some level of literacy and numeracy? How do we close the gender gap in secondary school, particularly in rural areas? Okay, so these are the types of questions that we have. So I just want to give you another example from another data set, which is the NSS data. And here we see that looking at the rounds 52 and 71, which was conducted in 1995-96 to 2014, what we observe is, if you look at children aged 5 to 9, here we see this is looking at current enrollment trends of children by age group and gender. We see there are differences across states. For instance, take, for example, Uttar Pradesh. We see that there's a 3% difference between males and females, even in 5 to 9 age group. But if you compare Uttar Pradesh to 1995, for 5 to 9-year-olds, we see that from 14% difference between boys and girls, the difference is now just 3%. Okay? And Odisha, we see that from 10% difference between boys and girls, now it's only 3% difference. And Rajasthan, we see from 26%, the difference has shrunk to 3%. So the trend is in the right direction for primary school, at least. What about children aged 10 to 14? Here as well, we see that there are huge gaps in nearly all the states, except Kerala, where we actually have more girls attending school in 95 relative to boys, but it's near universal in 2014. But in every other Indian state, and we're only looking at the big states here, we see that there is a gap. It's very large in Rajasthan. It's 48% between males and females in the 10 to 14 age category. And by the time you get to 2014, that has shrunk to 10%. So the trend is in the right direction. Look at Bihar, from 29%, it's gone down to 2%. And now if we look at 15 to 19-year-olds, again we see that in 1995, there was a big gap in every state, nearly. But even though there is a gap in 2014, we see that that gap has declined quite dramatically in all the states. So Uttar Pradesh from 48% to 27% differences in enrollment. between males and females aged 15 to 19. We see Bihar, it's gone from 13% to 1%. So it's pretty good. The trends are in the right direction. We still observe a gap, but it's moving in the right direction. Okay, so the next thing that they did is they wanted to look at expenditure, conditional education expenditure for children that are enrolled in school. So remember we saw before that we are more likely to see boys being enrolled in private schools. So we see more education expenditure on boys' education for tuition fees, for private schools and so on. And this also shows that there are differences between boys and girls expenditures. So again, we see in nearly every state, the expenditure on boys is likely to be more relative to expenditure on girls. So expenditure is measured in rupees. And so basically, where we see an asterisk, it's statistically significant gaps. So we see that as we have seen between 1995 and 2014, where the Indian economy has grown quite rapidly, what we've seen is, in the previous slide, I showed you that there's been a big decline in, or rather a big decline in gender education gaps, a big increase in female enrollment. But what we also observe is that we see this big increase in female enrollment and a narrowing of enrollment gender gap, but there is an increase in expenditure on boys. So the gender gap in expenditure is in fact growing in some cases. Okay, so for instance, if you take some of the richer states like Punjab, for instance, between 95, where they were slightly spending more on girls' schooling, by 2014, they may be the spending on boys has increased quite dramatically among enrolled children. Okay, and we see this trend across all age groups. And then in the IHDS data set as well, they were interested in looking at whether the expenditure on male children was higher, and we see at the all India level that it was statistically significant and higher, and any education expenditure was higher, and it was higher in every age group across at the all India level. And then if you look at by states, we see that there are differences. And yes, so there are, for instance, we pick Bihar, any expenditure on boys is quite high in every age group, except 15 to 19-year-olds. Then I'll just briefly mention that some papers have looked at impact evaluation. So this is what we were talking a minute ago about. So we can't collect big data sets to look at whether certain policies have worked or not. So these people, I'll go through this paper in detail, Muralidharan and Prakash. They looked at the Bihar government cycle program and looked at its impact on girls' age-appropriate enrollment in secondary school, and they found that it increased by 32%. So they looked at DHLS dataset, and they saw that it reduced the gender gap in education between girls and boys by about 40%. And okay, so I'll go through that paper in detail. And then this paper looked at whether having women in leadership positions changes adolescent girls' aspirations and educational attainment. So if you have a woman in a leadership position, does it make young girls feel like we need to have, good education and so on? Then another paper is by Jensen, and he looked at BPO, the call centers. So he looked at randomly providing information about call centers and providing information on interview techniques and preparing young girls on job opportunities in BPOs, and looked at how that impacted on their career aspirations, enrollment in computer and English training courses, age at marriage and childbearing, and for the younger generation, whether the probability that they might be able to get a job in this sector led to any improvements in school enrollment. Okay, so, and then finally in 2016, Banerjee and colleagues, they looked at an intervention called Bal Sakhi program, where they help children at the lower end of the ability distribution. So children who are falling behind in class, each of them was given like a tutor to provide them with targeted instruction to help them improve their learning outcomes. So this is another intervention. So these are different interventions that have worked. Okay, so this is just a very general article, and this is like looking at what do we need to do about improving accountability in education in developing countries. So the point he starts making is that we see that across the world, we see there has been a great increase in education expenditures. Privately, households and parents want to improve their children's education. Investments, the government is also improving the percentage of GDP that they spend on education. We see that in 26 African countries, it increased they spend approximately about 6% annually, and it increased by that amount between 2000 and 2009. And in India, we see that there was a doubling of government expenditure on education between 2004 and 2009. And in sub-Saharan Africa, we see that 5% of GDP is spent on education. So education investments are regarded as being quite important. So, however, what we see, again, we come back to this point, is that although we see education spending and enrollment rates in schools increasing quite dramatically, learning levels are still quite low. We see low literacy and numeracy skills among school-age kids. And what are some of the constraints faced by these children and to some degree policymakers as well? The first one is, high pupil to teacher ratio, and teacher pay is usually quite low in many, schools in rural areas. There are a number of children who come to school, so it's difficult for the teacher to pay attention to improving learning outcomes because they're dealing with discipline-related issues. And there are infrastructure constraints, for example. So, for instance, sometimes even though the government is making financial transfers to schools, there's ineffective monitoring of the school systems, and we see that there's low parental engagement. We see that many schools don't have electricity, don't have proper toilets, don't have access to clean water. Many children don't have access to textbooks, or they often have to stand, there are not enough seats, and so on. So there are many, many constraints. And So what these two papers have done is they have looked at different schemes to improve learning outcomes. And they say that school grants, which is giving schools a grant to improve learning outcomes, or paying teachers extra, or to giving incentives to teachers to improve learning outcomes, are often found to be quite ineffective. This is because although the school grants have increased per pupils of spending, learning outcomes will not increase unless unless there's better engagement by parents as well. And many studies have found that there's no really a direct link between improving teacher pay and better education outcomes. Because even if you improve the teacher's pay, if the infrastructure is bad, or if the parents can't afford good school, to spend time with the children, or if the children are in school, they go back home and they have to work, which means they don't have time to focus on school-related activities. All of these will mean that the children's schooling will fall behind. So so they say that there's no real link between teacher pay and better education outcomes. They say that teacher absenteeism is a big concern, and so paying teachers a bonus pay and incentives that are combined with better pay might be able to improve student outcomes. Okay, so what do they suggest we do better? One of the things they say is maybe training or empowering, and funding local school committees. They say that at the moment, I think also this paper is not looking at one particular country. They're looking at maybe sub-Saharan Africa. And so one of the things they're saying is they're looking at maybe principals could get better management training. And the other thing they say is teacher absenteeism is quite a big problem in many poor schools and in rural areas. And then they say maybe if the parents were better engaged and go and and their engagement can lead to better accountability. And and again, this point that more private schools and competition may improve accountability. Okay, and just a summary of their what they think should be done to improve accountability in schools. Okay, so I just want to slightly change the topic a bit, and suppose that we want to have, from a policy perspective, we are interested in providing some sort of scholarship program for low-income students. Okay, so we want to give a scholarship to low-income students, and we hope that by giving the scholarship, the children's performance will improve. So what are some of the key challenges? So the first problem is the selection bias. This means that if the scholarships were merit-based, this means that the recipients would have better outcomes based on their own merit. So regardless of whether they got the scholarship or not, their performance would be quite good. So I think what we're trying to do here is to see under what circumstances a scholarship is good. If scholarship is used as an income supplement to poor households, then that's good. But if we say that the scholarship is to improve the performance of the child, then it becomes like, how can we prove that? Because we need external validity. So this means that if you implement a scholarship program in an area with low income on average, it may not have the same impact on improving outcomes in terms of performance of children relative to a place where children are more, if it's more merit-based. And then we use an estimator called difference in difference, where we compare similar sets of schools, and then we see if one set of schools gets the scholarship program and the other school doesn't, then is it the case that the school that gets the scholarship program has children that are performing better? Or if the scholarship is merit-based and we say that if you will get the scholarship next year based on your performance today, then that can perhaps act as an incentive. But to do this experiment cleanly, we need to be able to compare similar sets of schools. Okay, so this is just a divergence. I'm just giving you, from a policy perspective, to test the effectiveness of the program. We need two sets of groups, one who are similar in every respect. One group gets the program and one doesn't. And then we compare the outcomes and we see whether the group that gets the program has benefited from that program or not. Okay? Okay, so I want to go through a journal article, and this one is by Muralidharan and Prakash, and they looked at this Bihar government's bicycle policy. So this paper is called Cycling to School, and looking at whether this bicycle policy led to any improvements in secondary school enrollment for girls in Bihar state. Okay, so basically the idea here is that in many developing countries, we see the governments give out conditional cash transfers as a way of keeping girls in school. So for instance, in Bangladesh, some years ago, they introduced a program where they gave parents of girls a subsidy to keep the girls in school. And the subsidy was equal to the amount that the girl would have earned if she had been working as a child laborer. So another one is midday meal schemes. That's another sort of program to try and keep girls in schools. So another program, so sometimes they give out conditional cash transfers. In Mexico, they had a program called Progresa, where the mother was given the cash transfer conditional on children being enrolled in school. So the condition was that children were enrolled in school, only then that they would get that health, transfer for health. Okay, so other programs include, for instance, in Indonesia, they had a large-scale schools construction program. But these types of programs are not so cost-effective. So in Bihar, they introduced a very simple bicycle program, which was universal, given to all the girls who were about to go to secondary school in grade 9. So the aim of this paper is to evaluate the impact of Bihar government's bicycle program, which was launched in 2006. And the aim of this program was to improve secondary school access for girls. So just by way of background, and this is obviously information that you know already, Bihar is the third most populous state in India. It has a population greater than 100 million, and it had low levels of girls' enrollment at the time when this program was introduced. And particularly in secondary schools, enrollment was really low. And a very important barrier to secondary school enrollment is distance. So if distance is, if it's difficult for girls to get to school for safety reasons, parents may be reluctant to send their girls to school. So just to give you a bit of background. So this is looking at the 2008 district level household survey. So this survey is you can see from this survey that as the distance to school increases, the percentage of children aged 16 to 17, sorry, it's cut off there, who are enrolled in or completed grade 9 starts to decline. For both girls and boys, it declines. But what we see is that the decline is greater for girls than it is for boys. Okay, so in India, we see that it's declining and for girls, but Bihar at this time, the decline was much greater, with only about 35% of girls enrolled in school. In grade 9 at that time, in secondary school, we see that as the distance increases to secondary school, we see that big decline in enrollments. It comes down to about 20%. So at that point in Bihar, about 90% of the villages had a primary school, but only 12% had a secondary school. So the aim of this bicycle program was to improve girls' secondary school education. Okay, so this was launched in 2006. And the aim of the program was to provide all girls who are enrolled in grade 9 with funds to buy a bicycle, to make it easier for them to go to school. Okay, so this was all the funds. So this was like a universal conditional in-kind transfer. So this could only be used by the eligible girl. All the girls who were enrolled in grade 9 were eligible for this program. Okay, so it was quite cheap. It was about $2,000 rupees per girl child, and the funds were distributed through the schools in public ceremonies, and school principals were required to collect the receipts and provide the utilization certificate showing that the bikes had been purchased. Okay, so basically this was a cost-effective program, 2,000 rupees given out as a cash certificate given to the girls during assembly in schools, and the girls were then allowed, the girls' families could buy whatever type of bike they wanted, but they had to provide the receipt to the school principal, who then used it to provide the government that there was proof that a bike had been bought. And the good thing about this program, and the reason why it was successful, was that it was well implemented. And it was a cheap program, and it was there was no scope for leakage. Because it was done in a public ceremony with local government officials, school principals, and all the children there, and you could see who was getting it. Right? So we knew exactly which girl was eligible for that bike program. So it was universal, and it was a one-time transfer. You only get it once. And the public ceremony meant that it created social pressure for the parents to buy the bike. And what it also did was, it meant that you could see that a lot of girls in a village had the bike, and they would all cycle together to the local secondary school. So it had a big impact. And so the data that they used to test this is the DLHS, the District Level Health Survey, which was conducted in 2007 and 2008. And of course, this survey was not specifically collected to test the bicycle program. This was just collected. But it so happened that this survey took place 18 months after the cycle program was launched. And the survey asked households, the sample included households with at least one member who was aged 14 to 17, who lived in the state of Bihar and Jharkhand. They included Jharkhand as well, because the program was not available in Jharkhand. But Jharkhand and Bihar were part of the same state till 2001. And also, there was a household survey and there was also a village survey. So the village survey had a lot of information about education infrastructure, education facilities in the village, distance to the nearest education facility if it was not available in the village. So for instance, it allowed you to know how far the school was from the village, okay? And so this, in this paper, 14 to 15-year-olds are the age group that would be going to be enrolled in secondary school or grade 9. And 16 to 17-year-olds were not eligible for the program. So what you can see here is one cohort of group that was exposed to the program and another that wasn't. Okay, and they also use two other data sets. This one is a school level secondary school enrollment data by gender for both Bihar and Jharkhand. And this was for the period before the launch of the bicycle program. So the reason for that is this allows us to test for the parallel growth in trends in the growth rate of enrollments for both boys and girls. So for instance, we don't know for sure whether the increase in, or if there's any change in school enrollment in secondary schooling, we want to be sure that this is caused by the bicycle program. So to be sure of that, we need to look at it prior to when this program was introduced and look at this for boys as well to see if what were the trends in the data before the imposition of this program. And then they also looked at official data on the number of students who appeared in and passed the SSC exam, which was conducted in Bihar and in Jharkhand. And the reason for this is because we want to see whether, okay, so these girls are going to school, but we want to know if they went to school, what is the improvement in their outcomes? Do we see that they're going to school, they're remaining in school, or are they, like absenteeism or not attending school, just enroll to get the bike, right? So we want to be sure whether the bike program had any improvement in the education outcome. So to do that, they also look at the official data on SSC pass rates. So this will tell us whether the children that were enrolled in the schools, what was the impact on their performance in the SSC exam. So was it better and compared to prior to the bicycle program? And or in the sense that was it better for the older cohort, and then we see whether it was better than the boys, and then we're also able to see whether this program had what it implied for completion rates for secondary school. Okay. So they do like a triple difference in difference estimate. So the dependent variable is whether the child, the girl, was enrolled in or whether she completed grade 9, because the bikes were only eligible for secondary school girls enrolled in grade 9. So the treatment group are girls aged 14 and 15. And the control group are girls aged 16 and 17. Okay, so the data only collected households which had children who were in this age group, 14 to 17. Okay, so if you didn't have children in this age group, then you are not part of this sum. Okay, and the other thing to note is that the DHS data set was collected 18 months after the bicycle program was introduced. So it allows us to, it's given us a year and a half of data to be able to see what the impacts of this program were. Okay, so these are the main results. So we see that if you look at the treatment, so the treated group is the treat here should simply be interpreted as the likelihood of these girls in the treatment group being enrolled or completing grade 9 at age appropriate, at the grade appropriate age. Okay, and then we see this is the coefficient we are interested in. So between columns 1 to 4, they just keep increasing more and more variables, controls. And in the full set of results, here we see that the net enrollment increased by 5.2 percentage points. So what they do is they say that, in fact, to actually look at this number, it's 5.2, but what it is, it should be interpreted as a 32% increase in secondary school enrollment. Okay, so reason is that because this variable is defined as an interaction between treat, female, and Bihar, right, relative to Jharkhand. So to calculate this, you've got to add the coefficient for the constant, the coefficient for female, plus the coefficient for treat, plus this, and you get 32% increase in secondary school education. So that is a huge increase in secondary school education from this program, from a base enrollment rate of 16.3% prior to this program. So they are attributing this bicycle program as having a huge impact on enrollment. And then what are the other main results? The other results are that so this coefficient is the point that someone made before about we may not be able to capture the control group accurately. So here we see that treat is negative coefficient. It's simply the fact that students may enroll or complete grade 9 later than the age at which they were expected to due to grade repetition. So it somewhat tries to capture for that possibility that the control group may be, it might be negative. And then, so basically summing up this paper, we see that the cycle program increased secondary school net enrollment rate of girls in Bihar by about 5.2 percentage points. And then they looked at the impact on learning outcomes. So using the official administrative data on the appearance and performance in secondary school certificate, SSC exams, they find that there's an 18% increase in the number of girls who appeared for the exam. So this is sort of saying that this program actually had a big impact on girls appearing for this very competitive exam. And the impact was 18% increase. And then we see a 12% increase in the number of girls who passed the SSC exam. Okay, so this one, they're just looking at the other administrative data set that I talked about, not the DLHS. Then they also find, they hypothesized that an increase in secondary education, which is induced by this program, may also have other long-term effects. For example, if the girls are in school longer, then it may delay the age at marriage, it may delay the age at first birth. So overall, huge impacts of this bicycle program, and it was a very cost-effective program. So, so basically, they find that this program was very effective It required the transfer to be spent on the bike. It was targeted to the girl, and it was universal. I mean, it meant that it wasn't means tested or anything. Every girl could get it. And it reduced the cost of school attendance. And because of the public coordination of the program, in the sense that it was very publicly given out, it ensured that the right girls were able to benefit from the program. Okay. So the next paper is actually on Indonesia, but it's just, again, another big government program. And we want to see how this impacted on education and wages. So this is not about gender, but this is just looking at the effects of a large school construction program on education. And in fact, they focus on boys' education and wages. And reason for that is because they just didn't want to bring in like gender differences and those types of issues to this paper. They really wanted to focus only on the impact of the construction program. So this was a very large policy in Indonesia in the early 70s. So what it involved was the construction of 61,000 new primary schools. In 3 years, they constructed 61,000 primary schools. And they constructed these schools in those provinces where there was low enrollment of children in primary school. So the idea of this school construction program was to lower the cost of sending children to school. So remember, we always talk about distance being a big factor, right? So it's the same here as well. So if the distance to school is very long or high, then it's likely that parents will not send their children to school. So one way to address that is constructing a school, a wide number of schools. And this is obviously a very expensive program. So, but they were able to do this. So it was and you can see the benefits till today. So there were 3 main contributions of this paper. The first one is they wanted to estimate the impact of this program on school enrollment rates. And second, to look at the impact of the program on earnings. And third is to estimate the impact on returns to education. Okay, so this program was called the Empress School Construction Program. And this was, so Indonesia is an oil exporting country. So in the between 1974 to 79, there was an oil shock, which meant that the oil prices went up. So the government of Indonesia got substantial oil revenues, and they used this to finance various development programs under the 5-year plan. And one of these was this program called Empress School Construction Program. It was a very large program. Imagine they constructed 61,000 primary schools in just 4 years. So between 1974 to 1978, 79, they constructed 4 years. So basically, this program doubled the number of schools in Indonesia. So they ensured that there was 1 school for every 500 children. So this was a large change in policy. Prior to 1973, there was no construction. There was a ban on recruitment for public service positions. Many of the schools were like madrasas for religious instruction in Arabic. So there weren't any like Empress in any way for children to go to study, traditional types of courses. And the other good thing about this program was that it targeted areas where there were low school enrollment. So areas where the allocation rule was that the schools were built proportionally to the number of children who are aged 7 to 12 who are not enrolled in primary school. Okay, so if you're 7 to 12, you should be at least in primary school. And if you're not in primary school at that age, this means you're not going to school. So what they did was they looked at districts where there were high numbers of children who are not enrolled in school, and in those districts, they constructed these schools. And it was a big program. It was 1.5% of the Indonesian GDP, and more than one school per 500 children aged 5 to 14 in 1971 were built. It's the fastest primary school construction program ever. And simultaneously, they invested heavily in teaching and teacher training. So what is the question that we want to answer with this? So we know that education levels are a negative function of the cost of education. So transportation or distance is a significant cost. So the thing that they're trying to say here is that if the government increases the number of schools, this should lower the transportation costs, because this means that there might be a school in your, close to your area. So it's easier for you to go to school. It reduces the opportunity cost of travel. And the question is, does it actually increase education levels? Okay, so they constructed this school, but what was the impact of the school construction program on education outcomes? Is it the case that education outcomes grew more in areas where there were more schools? Did we see an improvement in wages of children who are exposed to this program? So what Esther Duflo does is she estimates a difference in difference type of estimator. And she wants to test whether education grew more for those in high program intensity areas, which means areas where more schools were built. Okay, so the thing is, suppose you want to measure the causal impact of years of schooling on earnings. So she wants to see whether those children or those people that were exposed to the program, the construction program, did they have higher earnings? So the basic problem when you try to estimate these types of models is that people with high ability will get more education. So it may be that the increase in earnings is not because of an increase in the school construction program, but only because these people may have higher ability. Okay, so unobserved ability will go into the residual of earnings functions typically. And so education in this case will be endogenous because it's correlated with the residual. So it results in bias if we were to estimate OLS. Okay, so education, in other words, may vary across individuals, partly for reasons that lead to what we call an endogeneity problem in econometrics. If you think about costs of schooling, if you live in a remote rural area, the cost of schooling is likely to be high. So it may take you an hour each way to go to school. So the opportunity cost is very high. And you may not acquire a lot of education. So this may be not because you're not as smart as the person living in an urban area, but it may be that someone who lives closer to the school is not spending 2 hours a day commuting. So the person who has more transportation time will face higher costs and will consequently choose fewer years of schooling. Okay, so the identification strategy that they use is, because this program was implemented over a very short period of time, We could think of this as a fall in the cost of attending school in rural areas. Okay, so suddenly in a short space of time, we see that the cost of attending school has dramatically reduced for one group of students. Okay, so in order to identify the effect of the program, so we want to be sure that this program has benefited the students who have entered schooling after the construction of this program. Okay, so in this case, we need to compare their outcomes. So this is the treatment group. We need to compare the outcomes of those exposed to the program with the outcomes of those who are not exposed to the program. And of course, the treatment was not randomized, right? So we need to think about selection bias. So what, in the sense that the treatment was not randomized, it was deliberately given in areas where there were low school enrollments. So given the design of the program, we know that this program was implemented, the construction happened between 73 and 79, and we know which regions these schools were constructed in. Okay, so based on the age of the person and the region that they were born in, we should be able to say whether they fall in the treatment group or in the control group. Okay, so it's easy to do a difference in difference. So we have, say, suppose we have two regions. Say we have a high program region. A high program region will be one which has received lots of schools. And a low program region is one that has received very few schools. And then we have two groups of people. We call it young because this program was implemented between 73 and 79. So if you were born after 1967, then you fully benefit from this program. And if you were born before 1962, you don't benefit from this program. So you have four groups of people: young and old, high intensity and low intensity. Just to give you an idea, so in this paper, she has focused only because we only want to look at the impact of the school construction program, and she was not interested in gender differences. So focusing on males will ensure that when we look at wages and returns to education, we are only looking at the impact of the program and it's not being affected by other factors. Okay, so only focusing on males. And we look at the data set called SUPAS, which is the national survey, intercensal, it's census in between two censuses, it was conducted. And the data set includes 150,000 men who are born between 1950 to 1972. Okay, so this group of people born after 1967 were the group of people that were exposed to the program when they were young. So this will take into this survey, 1975, includes the first cohorts that were educated in the new schools that were completed in 79, and they would have completed their education by 1995, and they would have started working. Because the outcome that we are interested in is the wages that they get having gone to school. Okay, so we have two sources of data. A survey, this is the SUPAS survey that was conducted in 1995, which collects data on individuals, education, earnings, and their district of birth, and all other control variables. And then we also have district level information on the number of new schools that were built in these districts between 1973, 74, and 1978, 79. And the key variables that we are interested in are education, year, and region of birth, year of birth, region of birth, and their wages. So two factors could affect program intensity. One is the region of birth. We know now for sure that the government only targeted low enrollment regions. So if you belong to that region, you would have benefited from the program. So we can see that there's good variation across districts. Some districts benefited and others did not. Okay, so what would we find if we compared regions that received more schools with those that received fewer? Then we are able to see that, is it the case that those districts that received more schools had those people that were in those districts had better education, and did they end up with higher earnings when they grew up? Okay, and this could be a good measure of the program's effects. Okay, so this table is looking at differences between regions with high and low intensity. So people that were aged 2 to 6 in 1974 would be the people that would have benefited from the program. So children have data. So if they were aged 2 to 6 years in 1974, they would have been just about to enter primary school and they would have benefited from this program. And if they were aged 12 to 17 in 1974, they would not have benefited from this program. Okay, so high refers to high intensity areas. These are the areas that received more schools. And low refers to areas where there were no new schools or hardly had any new schools built. Of course, we see that there are, more years of education in those among children from low intensity areas. That is to be expected because remember I told you that the program was targeted at areas that were low enrollment, so that those were these ones. But the important point that we are interested in is we are interested in the difference in difference, right? So the program effect is 0.12. In other words, we are interested in the intensity of the program, and what we see here is the growth, the difference between children that were in the high intensity areas, children that did not benefit from, or cohorts that did not benefit from the program versus cohorts that benefited from the program. That difference is 0.47. And then we look in the low areas, the difference is 0.36. So the difference between these two, high and low, is 0.12. And this is the impact of the program on education. Okay? And if you look at the wages, again, we see that the wages obviously are higher in low intensity areas, but what we see is there is a slight improvement here of 0.026. So this is the log of hours of wage was 0.026 higher. So in other words, what was the effect of the program on education? So the difference in difference shows that education grew more in high intensity areas where more schools were built, and higher education in low intensity areas, which is to be expected because of the way in which the program was designed. And the difference in the number of schools per 1,000 children is 0.90. Okay, in other words, this is the difference between the number of schools constructed per 1,000 children in high and low program areas. So one school per 1,000 children contributes to about an increase in education of about 0.13. This is because the assumption is that in the absence of this program, this difference in difference should have been 0. So there should have been no difference between high and low areas. So the 0.12 is the causal effect of the program on education. That's the way she interprets this. What about the effect of the program on wages? What she shows is that earnings grew more for those in high intensity areas where more schools were built. Okay. Earnings grew more here. Okay, so between here and here we see earnings grew more. This is the difference we're looking at. So again, the way that she has interpreted this is in the absence of the program, this difference would be 0, which means there's no systematic difference in schooling attainment depending on age and region. So the 0.026, although it's small, can be interpreted as the causal effect of having this program. Okay. And then if you look at the control areas, we don't see much of a difference. It's close to 0. Okay, if you look under panel B, which is the control areas, the difference is just close to 0. Okay, so summing up, what we have seen here is that in all the available data sets, we observe that gender enrollment gap in primary schooling is closing for India, and we still observe greater expenditure on boys' education relative to girls. What we then see is that this is increasing gendered learning outcomes. It's unclear whether this is related to gender differentials in labor market returns or whether it's parental bias. And then, of course, we see that there's heterogeneity across states, by caste, and by rural-urban differentials. And so we can see that social factors still play a role, and we see that some government interventions seem to be increasing enrollment of girls. Okay, so with that, I've finished my presentation. So